Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Minister of Finance for Brazil, Mr. Joaquim Levy, for a conversation moderated by Mr. Lourival Sant'Anna.
Obrigado.
Good afternoon, and Mr. Minister, thank you so much for making yourself available for this meeting.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
And I'll bring up some figures of the economy in Brazil, just for those who are not familiarized with the situation there. The fiscal deficit is now 9.3%, the GDP. Public debt is 66%. Inflation is now 9.5% for the previous 12 months. The target used to be 4.5, and the central bank interest rate is 14.25%, which is considered a ceiling informally by the central bank. And unemployment has reached 8.7%, which is really high for Brazilian standards for the past years. We were talking about a year and a half ago of almost no employment, virtually no employment in Brazil. And the purchase power is going down. That's why more people are looking for jobs. So that's the pressure over unemployment rate. And the risk assessment agencies are taking the investment grade from Brazil. And the minister is leading a fiscal adjustment, but he's terribly under pressure politically. He's supported by the president and maybe by the economic establishment, the business people, but even the president's party and other parties which were supposed to support the government are bombarding his fiscal adjustment. And the flagship for his, to try to make ends meet, is to bring back a tax over banking transactions, which is very unpopular and doesn't have the Congress support either. So, Mr. Minister, it's hard to say that, Mr. Minister, how do you fix Brazil?
Well, I think that you have to start with the diagnosis. You have to understand what's going on, and so you can design a strategy, and then you can convince people to follow this strategy. In terms of diagnosis, you have to understand that what is going on now is in some ways a consequence of a process that started a few years ago. In particular, usually when you have a crisis like we had in 2008, we would see two things. We would first see capital coming back to the financial centers because people would have to pay their debts, and so they would liquidate assets like in Brazil and faraway places, and you go to the financial centers. The second thing that people would see that, well, their markets will be in the depression for a while. That means that consumer prices will come down, and they would say, oh, let me also reduce the prices of commodities. So the big buyers of commodities would lower their price. This is typical. For 150 years, that's always happened. There is a typical cycle. You'd see capital outflows, and you'd see commodity prices coming down. Well, it just happened that this time was different. This time, we had coordination at global level where you have a tremendous injection of liquidity. So instead of having people having to sell their assets, people actually had money and want to buy new assets. And you saw so much of appreciation of our currency and so much acquisition and so on. So second, normally this was the counter-cyclical reaction, especially of the US, liquidity. China had also a counter-cyclical reaction, which was investment. Let's build, build, build. And that meant that instead of seeing commodity prices coming down, what you saw was commodity prices going up. And that was what we experienced from 2009 on. And also, often, when you get to a crisis like this, if our economy was fully synchronized, we also would be in a moment of overexpansion. But in Brazil, also for the first time, we got to a crisis like this, our accounts in order, lot of fiscal cushions, and also international reserves. So we also could do some counter-cyclical. And that meant that for a few years we avoided the brunt of the crisis. And actually we grew, and everything looked very easy. Fact is that counter-cyclical, there is no name cyclical, which means that after some time it come back. So in the US, you see that since 2013, you're going back, if not for a tightening, of course, monetary policy is trying to go back to normal. And this changed somewhat capital flows. Also, and asset prices and the value of the dollar. The second thing is, of course, China, after all this period of high investment, realized that they have to do with different policies, which had an impact on commodity prices. So we had faced a very important change in terms of trades, okay? A combination of less demand for commodities and also appreciation of the dollar, which makes the price of commodities in dollars even lower. Okay, and also we spent a lot of discussion. The fiscal cushion was worn out. And so now we don't have much money to continue stimuli and support for this, support for that. We had to do our own consolidation. So we are a little bit like the developed economies were in 2008, 2009. We have an advantage. We don't have high level of household leverage. We don't even have high level of corporate leverage, which means that the time of recovery will be much shorter. But you're right, you have a large nominal deficit. It's true that also, as you mentioned, because inflation is somewhat higher, it does mean that you have such an impact in sustainability because part of the nominal deficit is just nominal. And nominal GDP is also growing. But we have to fix our fiscal. And fixing the fiscal is very important. It's just the first step, but it's an essential step because it's the way for people to have confidence that you're not going to get more surprises. It's the way also to create an environment where interest rates can come down. And how do you fix the fiscal in a moment where, of course, after huge shock, in terms of trade shock, you have the economy slowing down? In a time also where you don't have much money to spend, so you cannot get out of the slowdown by spending more, so you have to spend less. Well, there are two things that you have to do. You have to have a hard look on the spending side, and you have to have new taxes, because in the short term, especially in an economy that's slow, you have to raise taxes. It's very unpleasant, but it's the way it works. If you look, for instance, in the UK, the first thing that the team of Mr. Cameron and Mr. Osborne did was to raise indirect taxes, VAT. In any place in the world, you have to do that so that you get the balance in fiscal accounts. So that's what we're doing. We are increasing some tax. In 2015, we try not to do that. We try to raise money by selling assets, by doing other things that you have no impact on the tax burden. Actually, the tax burden in Brazil has fallen in recent years. Actually, sometimes I joke that Brazil was the only country in the world at this time that was reducing taxes in the last few years. Yeah. So now we have in the short run to raise this tax, and you have to look at expenditure, including mandatory expenditure, entitlements. We don't have to be very harsh on that, but you have to increase the focus, the efficiency, the quality of this spending. That's fundamental. You have to target the spending because it's big. In Brazil, just Social Security is 40%, amounts to 40% of the primary expenditure. If you add to that other social benefits, you get to 50. If you add another 100 billion reais, which is about $30 billion on health expenditure at the federal level, you don't count at the subnational level, you see that most of our spending is in social transfers. And you also have tax expenditure, because as I mentioned, in the last few years, Brazil was reducing taxes through tax breaks for a number of billions. We have to review that. You also have to review the effectiveness of some tax breaks. Are they really achieving what they're supposed to achieve? If not, how you can redirect this spending to something that will be more efficient, or just avoid this spending so that you get a better debt dynamics. So you're in the midst of that. Now, Brazil is a democracy. It means there's some things you can do on your own, executive orders and so on. Some things you have to convince Congress. Congress have their own interests. Some of the things came as a surprise for Congress. I realized that not everybody in Congress thinks about the economy every day and every night. They have other interests, so you have to focus their interests, and this is what we're trying to do. It's taking a little bit more time than people thought we would do for some very specific reasons. But I think it's moving on, and more people realize that we have something that, as a shorthand, we've been saying is a 1, 2, 3 for growth. One, you fix the fiscal. Confidence comes back, the exchange rate stabilizes, credit comes back, and you have a surge in demand. Right now, demand is very depressed in Brazil because there's so much uncertainty. So everybody stopped to make decisions. When you clear the fiscal, people start to make decisions again. Life comes back to normal. So you get the demand. Demand is easy in Brazil. Usually, it's not very difficult to get demand. Then comes the hard part, which is the number 3, which is supply. And there you have to do these so-called, economists like to call, these structural reforms, which means I have to address the real problems of the economy. You have to go to the labor market and see what you can make it to, at the same time, be more flexible, but it does mean that you really reduce what is relevant in terms of protection. What you do in terms of competition, how you move ahead in terms of free trade. This is the third part, but it's not that you're going to address it later. It's just because it takes time, you have to start to address now. So after you have the surge in demand, you don't hit a wall, but rather supply can go beyond just a catch-up, and then you have sustainable growth.
I was going to come to free trade because there is a lot of resistance in the industry, in the economic agents in Brazil, which have benefited from a lot of protectionism. And Brazil and it will be a way out for this impact that we had with the lowering of the price of commodities would have been smaller if we had more added value exports. So Brazil is staying out of global agreements of free trade. So aren't we missing an opportunity, a historic opportunity again?
Well, 2 things. First, again, diagnose. Brazil is a market economy. It responds to relative prices. Now, 15 years ago, the share of manufacturing in our exports was higher than now. Why? Because during 10 years, we had high commodity prices. So in a free economy, people would put a lot more of energy in terms of agriculture and commodities. Mm-hmm. Also, there's a question of taxation. Industrial sector is much more taxed than agriculture and than primary sector, and even some service sectors. So that, of course, works against industry in Brazil. But looking ahead, I think that free trade is becoming something that's much more understood. Actually, my life is much easier because my colleague in the industry ministry and trade and industry ministry, actually he believes in free trade. He is working, we are working hand in hand and with the president on talks about free trade with Mexico, Colombia. We actually have told the European community Union that we are ready to present our offer, Mercosur offer, including Argentina, by November. We are actually now, we want a date for European Union making their initial offer too. And then, of course, we have to initiate negotiations. We know they're busy with important treaties and agreements and so on. But we are ready. We are knocking the door, and we are going to make a very meaningful initial proposal. And like I said, we are talking with others. We're also talking about facilitation of investment. And I mentioned, I think, early today that investment has been the real vector of integration in Latin America, more than trade. Brazil is a country that's very open to investment. We've been one of the major destinations for foreign direct investment. Usually among the developing countries, they are second, sometimes third, but we are really in the forefront. There were years that we got more direct investment than most of the largest European countries in recent years. So we get a lot of investment. And you get investment from Asia, you get investment from the US, and you get also investment from other Latin American countries. And we also invest abroad. So I think that stars are aligned for us to get more into the value chains. And this is important change, less thought. Brazil is a large economy. So for too many years, even multinationals and others will think, okay, we go to Brazil and you supply Brazil, perhaps a little bit of the neighbors, and that will be enough. So it will be the end of the value chain. And actually, in recent years, we made some of our effective protection a little bit too much geared toward this model, which is not a really wealth-generating model. Now, we understand that you have to be not only the final destination or the final end, but a part of the whole chain. And there you have to make some changes, not only in terms of, let's say, free trade, but also in terms of taxation and so on. And actually, it's a very good moment, because the discussion about international taxation has moved dramatically with BEPS and some of other discussions at the level of OECD and the level of Europe. I mean, the concept that the taxes have to remain where the value added happened, that was a difficult that we had because of transfer prices and this kind of things. This discussion has changed. The discussion about transfer prices has become much more clear, and I would say more favorable to countries like Brazil. So that also facilitates we to get more involved in global value changes and use the diversity of our own industrial base, the skill of our people, the size of our market, to leverage activities of firms that you produce not only to the Brazilian market, not only final products, but also parts, pieces, and have this model like you have with airplanes. And actually have to, so for instance, I didn't mention this in the morning, but in the agriculture industry, we export a lot of parts to South Africa, for instance. They do tractors, they do all these implements for agriculture, mechanized agriculture, often with parts that come from Brazil. So that's type of integration that you have to do more with our African partners and also elsewhere in the world.
Okay, let's turn to the audience, because we have a very qualified audience here. And we take like 4 questions and then go back. You first, sir. Okay, mic for him. Okay, then here.
Thanks. My name is Pablo. I'm from Mexico. I'm part of the emerging leaders. So my question was directed about energy. That's what I focus. So my question was related to Petrobras. Petrobras has a great future with the pre-salt. Next decade it will be great, but Petrobras is also the most indebted oil and gas company in the world. So that's going to be a bit challenging. So my question was pre-salt. Now Petrobras has to operate those fields. Do you think it would be time to perhaps reassess that policy to allow the other major oil and gas companies to come in and help Petrobras doing this major endeavor? And the last one would be Mexico just opened its energy sector. Round 1 was first not so good, then it improved. Do you think that round 13 in Brazil showed that things must be changed, stuff like local content? So overall, what's your take on energy in Brazil? Thank you.
Thank you. Here, just wait for the mic. Please identify yourselves. The mic here, please. Okay, thanks.
Right here. Marcos Freitas from Brazil. Minister, it's actually 2 quick questions. Our neighbors down south, Argentina, had the election last Sunday, and it was surprising to see Macri getting so many votes, which shows that Argentina is willing to change the model. It hasn't worked out very well for them, and it seems from the public opinion that there is a time for them to change. Now, after the measures that you're taking, will Brazil be a more liberal country? Will it be more open for business? What are the challenges? Brazil. What are the challenges that we have to make the Brazilian economy actually flow? And there are so many ties sometimes. What are you doing to make it more liberal in the future? And what do you think will be your legacy when you leave the ministry in the future?
Okay,
when you retire?
We'll take these two questions, and then I'll go back to the ones who have asked for. So
goodness.
Petrobras, your assessment, and your future.
Okay. Well, with Petrobras, I think that they are doing the right thing. They are focusing on their core business. You know, companies sometimes start to be too big, so they are divesting in a number of business, and I think this will be very good for Brazil. Taking the question of that gentleman, when you have a company like Petrobras divesting, you attract a lot of new people to some sectors. Say, for instance, gas. They're selling their pipelines. This is good. A lot of people want to invest in the pipelines. And with these, we're also going to attract other people that use gas, even imported gas or locally produced gas. We have a lot of small companies that will play an increasingly important role in producing gas, a bit like in the US. You have a lot of small companies, especially on the ground, not offshore. So I think that by focusing, by being more efficient, of course, we all know that costs in the oil industry really skyrocketed in the last few years. So now costs also coming back to some more real system. So I'm confident that they will develop this huge reserve of the pre-salt. And let's be clear, pre-salt is done with all sorts of partners. I mean, you have Shell is there. In the Libra field, you have Total, you have Chinese, you have people from all from the world.
Yeah, so
okay?
Petrobras took legally a huge part of it. They had
to
be.
There's a subtlety about being the operator, but it doesn't mean that you operate alone. We can review that. You can give more freedom to that. Things change. Brazil knows how to adapt. Okay, but you should not construe that Petrobras is doing everything alone. I mean, even Akon was there, and you name, all the companies are there. Chevron has some fields, and so on and so forth. So even in the pre-salt, okay? So I think we read, yesterday when I was coming here, was reading about a number of oil companies that have reduced earnings because they had to make impairments and so on. So it's natural, it's healthy that Petrobras is also doing that. I think that in Brazil you have more people, you'll be good. Everybody has been participating. You think about Shell. When Shell bought BG, it's not me who is saying that, the company says, we bought BG because BG has a large stake in Brazil, and we believe this is the way to go. It's a place where you don't have wars, you don't have any risk. For Petrobras, it's also nice because you have the reserves in the backyard of your own market. I mean, very few companies in the world, you have both sides, the consumer market and the reserves, I mean, virtually together, okay? So I think this is a particular strength of the company. And of course, all the proudness in terms of the technology, everything that they have developed and so on and so forth. Now, about Argentina, I don't know, they go to polls and let's see what happens. What do you want to achieve? I think it's what he asked me. We have a problem to solve, you have to solve, and you have to set a little bit of a template of how Brazil will deal with this post-boom period. I mean, how you go back to use all the advantages that we have. I mean, the diversity of our economy. We have a pretty large industrial base. It has to be revamped, get back to work. Okay, and I think with the change in the exchange rate, which was a natural one, just reflect the change in relative prices, they become more competitive. What can we do? We can facilitate tax payments. We can make the economy more efficient. We can have, as I was mentioned, this third step, the structural issues. And I think there is increasing convergence to that. If you read let's call it manifesto, that one of the leading parties in Brazil has issued a couple of days ago, if you look at what's there, it's exactly what we're trying to achieve. And it's making an economy that is more productive, more efficient, and that will be able to sustain continuous increase in labor income.
Okay, so I remember we had Someone, yeah, I owe you. Then here, okay. Then someone on the back, yeah.
Thank you. I am Marta Lucia Ramirez from Colombia. Minister, you have mentioned that you have to review the social transfers in Brazil. And we all know how important has been the Bolsa Familia, not only for Lula government, but also for Dilma and the politicians in Brazil. And I would like to know how can you manage, without very high commodity prices, the transition to this new old agenda, which is a traditional agenda, how to become a competitive country, how to develop a productive sector with manufacturing, with agribusinesses, how to strengthen institutions in order to prevent and also to avoid the corruption within the government and also within the Brazilian society. This is not only a Brazilian problem. This is a Latin American problem. This is something I mentioned yesterday. But how do you manage this future agenda without the richness of all these commodity prices in the last decade?
Okay, thank you. Here, please. Here.
Mr. Minister, my name is Gregory Craig. I'm a lawyer in Washington, D.C. You mentioned in your opening remarks the importance of foreign direct investment to Brazil's future economic growth. I have two questions about that. To what extent have the legal proceedings in Brazil and the equivalent economic results of those proceedings had an adverse impact on foreign direct investment? And to what extent, the second question is, to what extent have you been successful in streamlining the tax procedures, not necessarily the tax burden so much as the bureaucracy associated with tax, which has been an impediment to foreign direct investment in the past?
Yeah. There was someone on the back. Okay.
Bonjour. Hi, Minister.
Please identify yourself.
Ludovic Suran, and I'm an economist. Brazil imported more inflation than growth from the last World Cup. You're organizing the Olympic Games. What do you plan to do to make sure you can lift, at least temporarily, some of these trade and capital account barriers to make sure that you won't import more inflation at a time that you still have this problem on your back?
Okay, so let's take those three then.
Okay, let's take these three. Well, I think that first, we have to be very clear about Bolsa Familia. First, it's something that doesn't cost much money. It has increased a little bit more in the last few years, but even now, it's about 0.5% of GDP. Now, when you bring millions of people to a different step in life, you make them able to participate in a market economy, especially when you're talking people in the countryside, that's extremely valuable. We all know there are some minimum levels that when you go over this threshold, a lot of other things are made possible. If you don't have this money, it's hard to send kids to school because, I don't know, you cannot buy clothes for them to go to school. These small things make a huge difference. So overall, the cost is not, say, an issue. Now you have to monitor, and actually you are constantly taking people in and out of the roles. Last year in 2014, I would say about 12 million people were sacked from the role, and some number also came in, because we're checking all the time if they continue to satisfy the criteria or income level, need, and so on and so forth. Now, we have a lot of other benefits, and like in any country, but really wage is not this type of thing, is much more, for instance, pensions. And in some cases in Brazil, you have, for instance, rural pensions that have very different conditions than urban pensions. And of course, this open room, the room for people to make some arbitrage. It's much easier to retire in the rural scheme than in the other. So you have to look carefully and see if people are not abusing that, okay? And you have to tighten requirements or unify the system. This is the way, for instance, in the case of the retirement to pensions, to make huge economies. You have to make the right diagnosis. And we are bringing people, even external people, to look at all these things. Expenditure review at its basic. Any country, any company has to do that from time to time, okay? You review your products and you review your process, and you change whatever you need to keep being efficient. As with the investigation and so on, I think it's not a problem only of Brazil or only of Latin America. I think it's a global problem. In Latin America, we're fortunate to have not only very independent judiciary that really go after people, and other institutions, investigation. Police is very free in Brazil. Okay, they are not controlled. You cannot say, don't do that, to do that. They get orders from the judiciary, they go after, and they find whatever they have to find. And moreover, we have a press, a very free press. Some of their representatives are here. I thought I would be asleep here, nobody will follow me. I came to realize they are very diligently taking notes here of everything that they say, okay? But this is good. After all, this is good, okay? So I think at the end, this only helps us, okay? Makes the country stronger, forces us to adapt institutions, simplify the life of people. I think that direct investment, like I said, has been very strong for many, many years. Would the investigation create a shadow in Brazil that people would change perception? I don't think so. I think that to the contrary, people will increase their confidence in Brazil. It's hard to go through this process, but it only strengthens the confidence that people have in Brazil. As of taxes, we are trying hard, but there are no gimmicks. Because in relation to our development level and given our income distribution, taxes are relatively high. Of course, whenever rates are high, the incentive for people not to pay is higher. It means that enforcement has to be stronger. So what we're trying to do is to simplify taxes as much as we can. Even this tax that is meant not to be popular. One of the great advantage of this tax is that it's very easy to enforce. It's very transparent to enforce. You have a bank account, you take money, you pay a tiny tax. That's it, no questions. You don't have to send people to look, you don't have to do anything. It's automatic. Okay, perhaps also this is why it's unpopular in certain circles. But this is important, and we are trying to do in Brazil, like I said, because of the difference in income distribution, a lot of taxes come from indirect taxation, not from income taxation. Income taxation in Brazil actually is very low, and high-earning people usually form a company and are shielded from the highest bracket of personal income tax. Everybody knows that, and this is the way it works. Sometimes it works too much. But so, indirect tax is so important. Indirect taxes is paid ultimately by the consumer, but immediately by companies. And because Brazil was one of the first countries to have VAT, back in the 60s, at the time, countries would have just sales tax. We had introduced VAT, but you need to improve them. I mean, these Aston Martins in the old James Bond films are great, but now people use different cars. We have to do the same with our VAT, and this is what we're doing. We're simplifying. We're making much easier for companies to pay the VAT. I'm not going to get into detail, but this can have a tremendous impact on facilitating tax compliance and make it much more transparent. And because we have VAT at federal level and subnational level, we are working in both. These are core part of our agenda in this third step of facilitating the increase in the supply side.
The World Cup and the Olympic Games.
The World Cup and Olympic Games. I don't know if imported inflation or whatever. We knew beforehand that the World Cup would not generate a lot of money. Not the least, because imagine, in any World Cup, people will take a day off to watch when Brazil is playing. Now, when the World Cup is in your own country, of course, you knew that for June, people would stop, June, July. And air companies also knew they would not make money because an air company makes money with their business traveler. Now, all the business will stay home to watch the games and so on and so forth. So There is no surprise there. And I think it went fine. I mean, the organization was fine. Everybody was, well, not happy, but relieved that there is no real problem. I mean, it showed that all the logistics went fine, no incidents, no terrorism, anything like this. Now, the Olympic Games is somewhat different because it's basically in one city, and preparations have been pretty good. I have to say that the Olympic Committee has been very strong partnership, the International Olympic Committee. They have been quite supportive. There's a good dialogue. When you have anything to solve, we sit together, we solve. No problem whatsoever. The mayor of Rio is, how many of you know the mayor of Rio? A few ones. I mean, very energetic, direct guy who has brought the private sector to help. So a lot of things that we're doing with the help of private sector. So far, I would say that most things are on time and on budget, which is very important.
We have to be on time as well, Mr. Minister. Unfortunately, we have to finish, but at least we finished talking about football, and no one asked about Germany versus 7, Brazil 1.
No, we're talking about the Olympic Games, July 2016.
Okay, thank you so much, and let's give an applause to the Minister.
Ladies and gentlemen, please stay in your seats for a few moments while we do a quick set change on the stage. And please welcome Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Mr. Jim Kolbe.
Okay, I think we've got the set changed, as they say here, quick set change, and a different audience or different set of participants up here, but I think a very interesting conversation that we're going to have. So I'm delighted to welcome today Thione Niang and and Professor Rabi Mohtar. I'll tell you a little bit more about them in just a moment, but I want to frame this just to give you a little bit of idea of why this session is here. And the reason it's here, think about it as the filling between two pieces of bread, if you will, the tasty filling in the middle of two pieces of bread. The first piece of bread was this morning when we talked about food security in Africa. And after these conversations, we're going to have a session on energy, an emerging Atlantic energy program. So the question is, how do you link those two? That's what we really want to talk about here today. And we have two rather extraordinary people here that can help us discuss those links and help us to frame all of that. So let me just introduce for a moment. The first one here with me is Thione Niang. Thione is with Akon Lighting Africa. I think at least many of our emerging leaders certainly know about Akon, a popular music star in Africa and even in the United States. And he is from Senegal. I can't help but resist mentioning that he comes from a family of 28 children. I'm just trying to think of how many nieces and nephews you must have there, but there must be an awful lot of them there. He came to the United States in the year 2000, studied in Ohio, went to school in Ohio, at a business school there, and became very active in democratic politics there, was active in the Obama campaign, was appointed as a liaison to the minority communities by President Obama. In 2009, he helped launch an organization called Give It, which is an NGO that works with young leaders promoting economic and social progress, which today is operating in many countries around the world, I believe. And he's now, of course, teamed up with Akon to be the founder of Akon Lighting Africa. And we're going to come back to what Akon Lighting Africa is in just a second. But let me just also introduce Dr. Rabi Mohtar, who holds 2 titles as the founding director of the Qatar Environmental and Energy Research Institute, and also is a professor at Texas A&M University. He tells me he teaches a course now in Nexus, which I'm really going to be interested in finding out exactly when a student signs up to say, I'm studying Nexus, exactly what they're studying here. But he's done extensive work on the Nexus, or the link, if you will, between energy and food security. Originally, Dr. Mohtar comes from Lebanon. He's an engineer and is an engineer in hydrology, something that's a great interest to me coming from Arizona, where we have a very active arid lands program at the university I used to represent in Congress, the University of Arizona. Let me start with a question here with you, Thione, with Mr. Niang here. You've developed and championed what you call a 3-phase model to provide affordable, accessible, clean energy. Tell us what this project is about and what you see its future. How is it going to really make a difference in Africa?
Well, Akon Lighting Africa is a project that we started 2 years ago, a little over 2 years. I invited Akon to come and participate in the project that I have in Washington, now in 30 countries. It's called Give One Project, which we help to engage young people in entrepreneurship. We have been setting up incubation centers throughout the continent, in Europe also, even in Asia, but 19 other 30 countries are in Africa. When he came to Washington, when we finished the program in the White House, we sat down and we discussed what can we do for the continent. Both of us originally from Senegal, and I remembered growing up in Kaolack in Senegal, where my grandparents used to wake me up early in the morning to study, because prior to that night, the sun went down a little earlier. We grew up with no energy in my house, and traveling around the world and having the opportunity to see how things are going in the US but in other countries, I thought it was important to create that opportunity that I don't have for millions of young Africans. Today, 600 million Africans are without energy. So my background is not on energy. I have no idea what it is about. Akon, of course, background is not on energy. So we went out for 6 months looking for a third partner. So we found another friend of us from Mali who has been working on solar energy for quite a while in Africa. Then we teamed up and launched Akon Lighting Africa. As you can see from the beginning, that this is a very personal project to me. Today, in two years, we are in 15 countries. In all of those countries, we have 3-phase projects that we put together. The first one was to make sure that the public areas in these countries are lit up. Recently, we were inaugurating a village, remote village in Mali, in Kai, and we met so many women around 11 p.m. selling some mangoes, and some of them selling some watermelons, and some of the stores, everything is out. They're telling us, without these street lights, we usually close and go home at 5:30, 6 o'clock before it gets dark. Today, we go up till 11:30 or 12 o'clock for 2 reasons. Why? Because now they can make more money, but also there's security in the community. The street lights was important to us. Then we have the second phase. The second phase is now the home systems, to make sure that at home, the young person like me will be able to study their homeworks at night. And we've started the second phase. And the third one, which we are now implementing and modeling in Guinea Equatorial and in Benin, is the mini-grid systems, which will allow those remote villages that don't have no connection to the national grid will be able to have a solar mini-grid there that the whole community will be able to connect to. So this work is challenging. It's a lot of work, but we accept the challenges. We accept the roadblocks. What we don't accept is to continue as young Africans born in the continent to watch our people go through darkness. Because without energy, you don't have no economy, as I talked about the example of those ladies. Without energy, you have no education. Without energy, you have no health, because all those health clinics that I see throughout the continent in Kenya, when we went through those villages to give lights to those villages right outside of Nairobi, most of them can't go to the hospital at night because they have no energy. And this is something that's personal to us, and we are working hard to make sure the continent is lit up.
Thank you for that great description of it. I'm going to come back. I want to talk some more about, obviously, the energy, and we're going to link it back to the food security. But first, let me ask a question, an opening question for Dr. Mohtar. You've written and talked extensively about the link between energy and food security. In fact, I think you just told me you were at the White House last week talking about this very subject there. For a layman, or somebody that doesn't use that term very often, when you use the word nexus, what do you mean? And what are the practical, do you have some examples of some success stories of how using this nexus concept has actually resulted in change?
Thank you. I'll start with the need for the nexus and maybe try to shed some light on defining it. We don't have enough to run around in terms of resources. We are in a resource-scarce environment, and we continue as we move forward with a lot of stresses in terms of population growth, climate change, and this non-stationarity of the world we know. As a hydrologist, we used to predict future knowing the past. That non-stationarity in rainfall events, in the way we predict climate is one example of this uncertainty. So if I link the resource scarcity with the non-stationarity and the changes that's going to happen in the demography, in the population, and climate, along with a very significant element, which is the interconnectedness of these resources. The fact that you need energy to produce water, you need water to produce food, you need energy to produce food, and all of these very, very interlinked system. In the past, we had a lot of buffer, and we could afford losing that interconnectivity because we had enough. As we move forward with a lot of gaps in terms of water gap, food gap, people are talking about 40% future water gap. We're talking about doubling the food supply. We could argue whether doubling or the White House issued last June 75% more. We could argue about the numbers, but one thing we don't argue about is that the fact that these systems are interlinked and we are in a resource-scarce environment. For those reasons, we're losing the buffer. And we're moving into an interconnected system where we define these interlinkages at the local level, at the regional, and then the national level. Definition is in 30 seconds, you could realize that these systems are interlinked. This is the beginning of that realization. We need to quantify these interlinkages. But one thing more importantly is after you put these interlinkages in a quantifiable term, what do you do with them? And you start looking into futuristic scenarios of what are the trade-offs between water and food. And yes, there are. We talked earlier about the trade-off between food and energy, trade-off between water and food. These trade-offs need to put in context. And unless we develop a dialogue that takes these trade-offs into public discussion, we're not going to make a move forward. On the examples piece, two examples come to mind. One is the Qatar National Food Security Program that led the food portfolio, food resilience in the state of Qatar, looking holistically at that whole system. And I'll talk more recently about Texas, and one of the cities in Texas that is I would say, a prime example of the nexus is 1/3 of the water is going to industry, 1/3 is going to municipality, and the 1/3 is going to agriculture. And these three sectors are growing independently for with an assumption of future forecast for water demand. Unless we bring all these three sectors into one platform, and the industry is predominantly the hydraulic fracturing industry, unless there are trade-off and discussions about what are the priorities, and how are we going to partition and manage the water for the good for the whole, we will be losing that prime resource. So we are working on that trade-off analysis where we do the analytics. The scientific community is good at that, but we stop at that analytics, and we need to take it one further step forward, where the analytics become a catalyst for the debate, a debate that happens to be inclusive, all the stakeholders to be in the room to discuss, these are the trade-offs. Do I use my water for hydraulic fracturing for energy security for the country, or I use it for food production, or I use it for a growing urban population? Those are in conflict, but we need to move from that conflict zone to a zone of a green zone where we start talking about these discussions and make collective decisions about the future. And this is where the platform that the Nexus allows, that it wasn't available before.
Well, that's very interesting because I guess in a sense in Arizona we were talking about Nexus before I even knew what Nexus really was. When I was in the legislature, we redid the groundwater code in Arizona, and at that time Arizona was using 89% of its water for agriculture. It's still very high, even though we're considered one of the most urbanized states in the country. It's still very high, well over, it's about 70% today. So this issue of trade-offs was the exact issue that was involved in this redoing the code. But so we want to come back to that when we talk about policy and policymakers. But Mr. Niang, we've just been talking here about water and its relationship to agriculture. You've been talking about your project as for lighting. Do you see, since agriculture, we had the section this morning talking about agriculture making Africa sustainable and independent in its food production, but that can't happen in a continent like Africa without a lot of irrigation. Do you see a role for the kind of work you're talking about with Akon lighting in providing water, the pumping and the movement of water from one place to another?
Of course, we already been testing that in Mali, and I'm just coming here from the Gambia, where on our project we have an agricultural incubation center in the Gambia, a little outside of Banjul. I spent a week there, coming straight from there to here, where we have young people from Banjul we took to the ground, started agriculture, and what I identified there is the main problem is water. 3 months ago, we've given our first model, the pumping model that we needed to put in place in Bamako, a little bit outside of it also, where they're using solar energy to pump water to irrigate and also do agriculture. Akon Lighting Africa was just the first thing, but we knew energy, we have to do energy, was key. And the second thing after energy we want to do is to make sure we find ways to bring clean energy, clean water to Africa. And we are, at this time right now, exploring those opportunities. And pretty soon you'll be hearing the next announcement we'll be doing, the work that we're going to do in clean energy.
So you see incorporating the water into the work that Akon Lighting is doing now.
Exactly.
So that'll become an integral part.
Exactly.
Well, and so that clearly leads to not only clean water for sanitation, for drinking, reducing,
but for agriculture also.
But also for water sufficient for agricultural use there. Interesting. Right. Dr. Mohtar, what are some of the gaps that exist now that we see in the for making this Nexus work, whether it's in science or it's in technology or, for that matter, in public policy? And how do we address those through the Nexus?
I'd like to start with the stakeholders. Last week, ironically, I was in D.C. talking about the Nexus, and a group of computer scientists, very goodwill and lot of energy and a lot of concern about the farming community. And a big effort came into an e-farm. An e-farm is the new wave of having farmers have access to data. So I asked the question, how many of you have been on a farm? These are computer scientists, very bright, very good intention of doing something good for humanity. None of them. So before I answer, I'd like to put the context of this. And that's the farmer himself, if you're talking about food security. We need to ask them what they need, rather than us trying to put together a solution that's very elegant that they may not need. So some of the gaps is our understanding in what are the local needs. So framing that question within a context of the stakeholders. So I'd like us to start by defining the stakeholder, who they are, and trying to address their needs. In terms of the gaps, I mean, we could talk extensively about this, but I'm going to highlight one gap in each, in the science and in the policy, and maybe come back and how do we tie them. A lot of the science developed in many of the, what I call the farming community, if the context is about food security, is imported. We need local knowledge, we need local data, we need local technologies. We don't need an imported technology that will not find its way to resolving the local problems. So capacity building, indigenous knowledge need to be promoted, and based on that, the ground level for that is to look into adaptive technology for that. So the science, local, and I would emphasize local science, is very much in need. In the policy area, and we see this in our home country back in the US, and many, in fact, I haven't seen a good example of a good governance for these systems. We have silos, we have built silos in these primary resources, water, energy, food, and very difficult for these silos to communicate. So on the governance issue of these primary resources, we do need to invest on how do you create that platform to govern food security while food security is dependent on water security and energy security. So how do you govern these primary resources? That's the policy issue. And the last is how do we develop these kind of platform where policy, science are all together. You inform policymakers. We don't claim we shouldn't be in a position to make policies, but we should be in a position to provide science-based policy so that policymaker can make that informed decision. So we need the local information within a context of the stakeholders. We need to tie in the pieces of the governance of these primary resources, and we need to get the science and policy together.
Well, so what you're saying on the first part there is, put it very simply, one shoe doesn't fit all sizes.
Thank you.
Or one size doesn't fit all shoes there, whatever we want to say it. In other words, it has to be localized, and the kind of science and technology we use in one place may not work in another kind of a place.
I mean, I can give you tons of examples of how technology could fail. You could, I mean, I spent some years in the Gulf states, in Qatar. You bring a German technology that works perfectly in Germany. You take it in the deserts with a lot of dust. I'm talking about solar energy. It doesn't work. So you need to, on top of getting that nice, shiny material, you need to have a way to clean it. And a lot of the cleaning is water. So where are you going to get the water to the middle of the desert to clean it? So adaptive technology that is developed for the region, for the locale, wherever we are, is very, very important. The maintenance, the capacity building for fixing whatever maintenance needs happen. So that's why the local capacity building is extremely important.
Mr. Niang, it occurs to me that we didn't even say right at the beginning, but everything you've been talking about in terms of energy, developing energy and producing energy, is solar. Is that not correct?
That is correct, yeah.
Do you ever see a role for other forms of energy in what you're doing, or is it going to be solar, you think, sustainable energy?
Yeah, there's a lot of forms of energy
of course
has been tried all over the world. But when we look at what we can bring in, we've seen that in Africa, we have, in sub-Saharan Africa, 362 days of sun. And we have so much resources in the continent, and the sun being one of it that we will never run out of sun. So why not utilize the sun so we don't depend on oil or what was done in the US or in Europe and other countries that didn't work. Africa leaves the space now to try new avenues. And today, the solar market is very cheap. Not only is cheap, but technology-wise, it's very advanced. So we say, let's go explore it. We've created a partnership block where we brought in the Germans, people from the UK, companies in China, because whatever we might say is cheaper in China than anywhere in the world. And then we brought in Americans for quality control to make sure we provide the best in the market for Africa. But this is the two things that we came into that was issues that we had to resolve ASAP. When we went to negotiate with our partners, the most important thing was to make sure that we do the transfer of knowledge in the continent. Because many times foreign companies come in, they bring their workers to do the work in the continent. Then once the project is done, they go back home, right? So us being from Africa, children of Africa who went through it, we want to make sure what we bring in the continent stays sustainable. So in our negotiations, for example, in China, the thing was, well, we'll send you in each country 200, 300 workers. I said, no, what we're going to need is a manager and a quality control manager. Then we went to each country. To give one project, we're already around the continent. We took those young people, we trained them, and they're the ones who are installing now these lights we're putting in, and to do the maintenance that you just talked about. So we went on even further. We just launched now a solar academy, the first solar academy in Africa, where we train 30 young people every 3 months. Then as soon as they're done, we give them the job available. In 2 years, we've hired 5,200 young people are working across the continent, helping us to electrify it with solar. Why solar? Because that's, again, it's here. We're not going to run out of solar. It's cheap, it's sustainable.
Yeah. We're going to go to the audience in just 1 second. Dr. Mohtar, you and I have one quick follow-up to
very
what Ms.
quickly.
Yes.
We haven't had the chance to talk, so this is our first introduction. And my wish to you is to learn from others' examples.
Good.
What we don't want to have is another Indian example where we deplete our groundwater. So giving farmers free energy that they can pump their groundwater is great, but it needs to be managed properly because there's a trade-off between our water resources and ill-managed water management.
There's the nexus we're talking about.
So we need to be.
But even with the farmers, we don't agree on giving free energy, right? You know, in Africa, we're in a position today we don't want anything free. At least that's our motto. Keep the free stuff. Because we're used to the free stuff and it doesn't work. So our model is how we can make it in a point where people are responsible of their own to what we bring in.
It could be free, but when you have access to energy, that farmers have access.
I just don't know about the free energy. It just doesn't click right for me. I want to make sure that the energy we're bringing in, that's why our second point that I talked about in those 3 phases is prepaid. So even you taking it to the farmers, they have to be able to pay something.
That wasn't my point. My point is very simple. We need to look at something, new concept on water productivity. Okay. I want to make sure that this water that they're pumping is, water should not be free. That was my point. We don't want to deplete the groundwater for the sake of...
We're going to go to the audience, but the one quick question I had that we can ask very quickly here. We're talking about solar energy, Ms. Niang. And that implies it's sustainable, but it also implies that it has to go with the energy storage, which is batteries or whatever, and that's an area where we have a lot of work to be done, isn't it?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, because you talk about the marketplace, they can't turn the sun on at 11 o'clock at night, so they have to have storage for that electricity. That's a good important point. All right, let's go to the audience here, and I see some right here. Yes. Please identify yourself, and it's on.
Hi, so I'm Felicia from Colombia, and I'm one of the emerging leaders. I'm so glad you brought the financing and the prepaid because my question was for both of you. I think one of the gaps that you failed to mention is financing. How is Africa and the world financing all these projects that we're talking about? And the similar for you, it's how are you making sure that your business is sustainable, not only for the farmers, but for the villages that you're taking, so they can not only get the product, buy it, but also make it sure that they're returning your investment and returning all the other businesses you're doing.
You want to go first? Or?
Yeah, why don't you take it from the larger, and we'll take it down to the local level in Africa. How do we do this sustainable?
You're absolutely correct.
The financing
is one of the critical issue to get that get started, and I believe that it has to be financed. And I very much agree with the model. It has to be a PPP, partnership between private public sector, that the private sector need to invest. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. We know and I don't want to go into the governance, which has failed in terms of the water, energy, food in most of the African continent. It has to be financed, but we're yet at the beginning of that discussion. What's the governance structure that govern these primary resources? But financing is one of them. Incentive, pricing, all of this discussion was at the beginning. I can't agree with you more.
So, Mr. Niang, the village in Mali getting lighting for their marketplace, how is that financed?
Well, for the financing, this is what we are doing. There's two parts to it. The first one is with the governments first. The government takes care of the street lights to make sure that the mosque, the public areas, the church, the hospitals are taken care of. And for that, we come with pre-financing. We secured $1 billion line of credit with our partners. And we come in the country, we talk to the government to propose to come in with the pre-financing. When they tell us this is the localities that we want to do, we negotiate with them the terms of payment. It's got to be a government guarantee loan that we come in, we pre-finance it, and we electrify it. If every country is different. The recent contract we just got is Benin, where they pay every year, and they go from 3 years to 5, 6 years payment. Now, the second phase was to make sure how the population will get it and it's not free. So we did a study to go around those villages with our team to see how much they're paying in kerosene and candles. Because we don't want to bring something, even though it's solar lights, but we want to make sure people can afford it. So we bring the price up to the same amount of money that they were paying. Now the difference will be that it's safer health-wise, because for the environment, many of those villages are catching fires sometimes because of the kerosene. Health hazard is not healthy. So for that, they've taken our project. So it's a prepaid. You get the system, you have 1 year and 2 months to pay for it. And what you are spending in kerosene, you pay for it for the Solectra system. It's like a scratch card. You see in Africa, everybody using these telephone cards. Americans might not understand what that is, but if you start traveling here, you're going to start having top-off. So you do the top-off, and then when it's finished, you have to go back and recharge. In a year and 2 months, now the system is yours. You don't have to pay for it anymore. So what we did is, in those communities, we selected the young people. Job creation is very important to what we do. They're the one who will maintain, but then they'll be the one that will be selling those cards. And if there's problems in the system, they're already trained in our Solar Academy, then they can go immediately and fix the issues. The reason why we did that is because we were in Sierra Leone with President Koroma. He tells us, before you came to my house, everything you see in those lights was put in. Just 2 years ago by an Indian company. And 8 months later, the batteries went out, and all of those lights are not working. I've seen it in Dakar. I've seen it in Benin. I've seen it in many, many countries in Africa. I've seen it in Kenya, where people can put in lights, but there is no maintenance system behind it. Then the result, after a few months, those batteries need to be maintained. They all go out. So what we did is now recruiting those young people, training them to make sure that they have some money, and then immediately they help us to fix those problems every time there's an issue that occurred. So those are the two financing models that we have.
Maintenance of the system is a key part.
It's the key when it comes to solar.
Right. So
if you don't maintain it, after 8 months, you lose it. No matter how the battery is good, because it can rain, it can, sometimes the sun, anything, you have to make sure you take care of it.
All right, let's go to another question out here in the audience. If we see anybody else that has one here. Okay, we have everybody's fulfilled with their things, but let's, yes, we have one over here.
Thank you. My name is Hafsat Abiola Costello. I'm from Nigeria. I have a question for each of you, and since there were no other questions yet, perhaps I could ask. For you with Akon Lighting, I work with GIZ, and I remember you mentioned that you work also with the Germans. Is it with the German Agency for International Cooperation?
German company.
With the German government?
No, there's a private German company.
Private company.
Because I'm very interested in what you're saying, because I was serving in the cabinet of Ogun State government up until May, and we have a lot of interest from the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Germans to help with bringing renewable energy to us. And each of them have very different methods, which I've been enjoying watching the differences. But the Germans, I find that their method is perhaps the slowest and perhaps the best. The Chinese are very fast, and it's useful for us to have very quick solutions, especially in the urban centers, which is their area of interest, and they'll make quick money, quick returns from that. The Germans are focused on renewable energy for rural areas. And they have a different model from yours, which I would like to propose to you for you to consider. So you are the agent that goes in and you train and you also put in the system. What they do is a little different. They do proof of concept for private sector to show that it can work, and private sector then run. And what that will do is you could reach 100 million, you will blink and you can reach 100 million because you've proved the concept. And to do proof of concept is extremely hard because there are some policy gaps, policies that are needed that are not in place, that they work to identify and coordinate the introduction of those policies into governments and train private sector. Then they even train the financial institutions to provide the different kinds of financing of varied terms. So by the end, the private sector can just run. So you are one, but you could produce 1,000, or you could produce 10,000, and then you can see the multiplications of scale from that model. So it's something just for you to consider.
Thank you.
Could you very quickly ask the question for Dr. Mohtar, so then we can have them both respond. We're running out of time.
I'm sorry. So Dr. Mohtar, I found your presentation very interesting because you were talking about science and this nexus. And where I come from is a country where there are multiple ethnic groups always fighting and having different interests. And you talked about trade-offs and how you use your model to look at trade-offs between in the science and the policy. I wonder if it could be used even for actual interests, that maybe it's not even so much science, but it's just returns, varied returns, differing returns. If this person, the returns to this ethnic group would come at such a time and this, how could such a model, because I think some of the fights we have, the conflict we have in Africa, is because the mechanisms we're using to engage in the dialogue is not adequate to the problems and the complexity of the problems faced.
Let's go in reverse order. Mohtar, you want to respond first, and then we'll go. Yeah.
I come from Texas, okay? So we have similar issues with the energy sector, with the municipalities, with the agriculture. And some of the work we're doing is we provide the trade-offs, we provide scenarios. We don't provide solutions. So the audience, which is a multiple stakeholder, vertical and horizontal, at all scales in a vertical sense, from a local all the way to national, in this case, statewide, and horizontal, representing all of the stakeholders that are impacted. So the hydraulic fracturing is an example that we're analyzing the energy security for this state, which is an emotional issue. We want to have energy security, but it comes at a cost. The cost is the transportation sector is, in Texas, $2 billion a year is in wear and tear for the roads. Not all of it, some of it is induced by energy use. You have the other sector that's pretty much is deprived more and more from the water is the agriculture, food security issue. And if you don't have that sector satisfied, you're going to have some issues with food security. The third sector is the municipalities. A lot of the areas in Texas, the 3 of the top 5 cities, fastest growing cities in the US are in Texas. So there's an urban sprawl in many of these metropolitan areas that require more and more water. So this is a typical example of the nexus where you have competing need. And not everybody's going to have everything they want. or they need. There need to be an analytics, but the analytics need to go down, not biased to any of these sectors, but to provide the trade-off. And as a society inclusive, we need to decide what is more important, energy security, economic, social, environmental. When we define the metrics, then everything becomes a trade-off that society need to address. We'll be happy to talk afterward because it's very interesting to engage. This is basically a conflict resolution exercise that would like to see. So unless it's taken to these issues that are very much controversial, the science will be on the shelf and a publication. So thank you.
Ms. Niang, you want to respond to her suggested model that you should think about?
Yeah, sure. I'll think about it, and I'll see you after this. Thank you.
Okay.
It's a good model. I'd like to talk to you about it. In the meantime, we're going to stick with our model.
Okay.
Because it's working pretty well. So.
You said that, yeah, we're going to conclude here, but you said, I think in what I read, I think you've said that you hope to be operating in almost every African country in 5 years by the year 2020.
40 countries, yeah.
40 countries.
Because Morocco is a part of Africa, but they don't need it because they...
Yeah.
Yeah.
You think that's doable, feasible? Will the limitation be financing?
No, because we secured the most important thing was the financing. Before we jumped in the water, we went to get the money first because we knew the problem with many African countries is the financing. Many of these countries got plans to really electrify their country, but they cannot find the money. And I think that's where our model is so different, because we come with the pre-financing. So the first thing we did was to secure the money, then we come in to propose to the governments to what we can do. Yes, it will be challenging. We knew it would be challenging. I mean, a political strategist to doing energy in Africa, you know it's going to be challenging. Every day is a learning process for me and for Akon, for Samba, and all of our partners. But we're ready to take on that challenge because we're ready to change Africa. We were ready to make sure that the millions of people of Africa will have the same opportunities as me. I want the same thing that I have in America for my people in Africa to have. And I'm not going to sit aside and let other people to come to do it or expecting somebody to do it. We've coming back home to bring our contribution to what will change the continent. That's a role we have to take on. Every generation at some point will have to answer some key questions, right? In America, a young president called onto the country in 1960s, President Kennedy, to ask everyone, ask for what you can do for your country and not what your country can do for you. And today, in my generation, this new generation of Africans, are calling on to ourselves, to what we can do to change the continent. And it's going to take work. We know it's challenging, but we will do it. And if we fail to finish it, we know the thousands of young people who are training in leadership and entrepreneurship throughout the continent. I'm hoping they will take on the fight and make it happen.
Well, that's a great
Thank you.
Words to end on, I think. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I hope you can see some of the linkages between the two sessions that we've had on food security and the energy one we're having, and I really appreciate our two participants for their conversance here, for everything they've done to help us make those linkages. So please join me in thanking Dr. Mohtar and Mr. Niang.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.